Good evening, Trapped in History followers. Welcome to episode 48, From Tudors to Triumph, Elizabeth I Enlightened Chessboard. Now, for context, you may want to go back and listen to the last episode in which I did over Henry. That would be a little bit of a good setup for this one. I'm trying to kind of weave into our absolute monarchs as I'm heading closer into teaching Unit 3 in AP European History. I wanted to do an episode focusing on Elizabeth because over the last 7 years of teaching AP Euro, I have sort of glossed over her in history, and I kind of go right from Henry and the end of the Reformation in the 30 Years' War, just kind of right into Louis XIV. And I want to do more justice for individuals like Elizabeth I and James I. I'm going to do some episodes on them. I've also seen some AP teachers would like some breakdowns of about the English Civil War, so I think I'll do an episode or two breaking down the English Civil War, at least in terms of causes and the effects of the war. And just for context, that war taking place in England at the same time that the 30 Years' War is ravaging on in the Holy Roman Empire. Now, to continue on here, I'm going to do a narrative sort of breakdown of Elizabeth, and then I'm going to try to weave in a couple of primary sources that I'll mention in the narration. And also, I want to end an episode with a secondary source. I'm trying a few new things on these episodes in which we spotlight especially one particular person or event. I would love to take some deeper dives into not only some current or former secondary source historians to pay homage and respect to a lot of modern day historians and other historians after people's time and biographers, but also I would like to take a look at some revisionist history, because sometimes that could bring up some interesting points. Maybe not all that I agree with, but it's okay. It's not necessarily that I'm bringing up things that I only agree with, but I bring up certain topics in history, and then I leave it up to you, the listener, to determine whether or not you think that that is credible or not, or that is trustful or not. So as I said earlier, this episode will be called From Tudors to Triumph, Elizabeth I Enlightened Chessboard, and I'll end this with like a focus on how does she compare to the other sort of enlightened rulers, or at least absolute rulers. When Elizabeth Tudor became queen in 1558, she inherited a kingdom weary of decades of upheaval. The Reformation had torn England first one way and then another, starting with Henry VIII's break from Rome, Edward VI's Protestant zeal and enthusiasm, and Mary I's Catholic restoration with its brutal persecutions. The religious pendulum left anxious subjects, and Europe watched closely to see whether or not Elizabeth I would bring peace or plunge her realm further into conflict. Elizabeth's solution was practical, beginning mainly with the document The Religious Settlement of 1559. This led to a partial compromise both for Protestants and Catholics. By naming herself Supreme Governor, not head of the Church of England as her father Henry previously did, she struck a delicate balance. To Protestants, this affirmed independence from Rome. To cautious moderates, it left a space for some Catholic traditions still to exist. Her new church was similar in outward form, but flexible enough to avoid alienating too many subjects. Yet, her toleration had limits. For example, Catholic plots against her life were crushed immediately. Catholic Jesuit missionaries were hunted, and dissenting Protestants, frustrated by her compromises, often found themselves silenced. Elizabeth I in her reign thus became a careful negotiation between toleration and persecution. Beyond religion, the rule of Elizabeth I was marked by state building and conflict. England under her leadership was not the richest nor the largest power in Europe, but she transformed it into a formidable player. The defeat at the Spanish Armada in 1588 became a national legend, with Elizabeth herself addressing her troops at Tilbury in words that still echo. She said, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." I will elaborate on this more later. Abroad overseas, she cautiously supported Protestant rebels in the Netherlands across the English Channel, approved privateers such as Sir Francis Drake to harass Spanish ships, and presided over the first wave ever of English ventures across the Atlantic Ocean. Under her reign, England's navy strengthened and it lays the foundations for future expansion. Elizabeth's political style reflected a kind of limited absolutism. She was determined to maintain royal privilege, refusing to name a successor, managing her image carefully, and holding Parliament at arm's length. However, unlike true absolutists such as Louis XIV, that we will look at later, Elizabeth I could not simply ignore Parliament, as we saw in last episode in the precedent legally that was set under Henry VIII and his Act of Supremacy, which indirectly gives Parliament even more power for the future. And now Elizabeth is experiencing some of that struggle left over from her dad's policy. Elizabeth needed Parliament in order to raise taxes, to legitimize her religious settlement, and to affirm her policies. Therefore, she could not just simply ignore Parliament. Because some of you may think, well, why doesn't an absolute monarch just ignore Parliament? Tense exchanges will take place over her marriage and succession, show how her authority had limits, and how political life in England was always shaped by negotiation. As a Renaissance ruler, Elizabeth I was deeply educated in classical text, languages, and humanist ideals. She used humanist and classical imagery to craft her identity, likening herself to Deborah, the biblical queen, or Estrella, the classical goddess of justice. Furthermore, her reign was also a cultural flowering. The Elizabethan era produced individuals such as Shakespeare, Marlowe, Spenser, and a courtly culture of art, poetry, and music that projected power as much as it delighted its audiences. Patronage of exploration also extended this Renaissance spirit into voyages of discovery and the beginnings of overseas empires. As stated earlier, she had a great deal of influence on the first English voyages across the Atlantic. In the future, we will address this as we look at James and we bring along him and the namesake of the famous colony known as Jamestown. Elizabeth's reign also highlights gender in politics, the first time this school year that we are really looking at this. As a woman in a patriarchal society, her rule was constantly being questioned. Foreign ambassadors mocked her singleness. Parliament pressed her to marry, and many doubted a woman could lead armies or manage a state. However, she turned her gender into a strength, styling herself the Virgin Queen, married only to her people. In speeches like the one given in Tilbury, she openly acknowledged her body was that of a woman, but claimed the courage of a king. In doing so, she redefined what it meant to be a sovereign ruler in early modern Europe. Historians have long debated Elizabeth's legacy. Early biographers, such as William Camden, painted her as a sort of near-mythic national heroine, a Protestant savior who defended England from Catholic Spain. Later scholars, though, like Wallace McCaffrey, emphasized her practical nature and the limitations of her authority. More recent historians, such as Tracy Borman and Estelle Perenacki, explored her use of symbolism, diplomacy, and court politics. Even revisionist views of history question the whole Golden Age label that was applied in retrospection of her reign, pointing to issues such as economic hardship, religious persecution, and factional struggles beneath the glitter of Shakespeare and the defeat of the Spanish Armada. Finally, as the listener, you may wonder how we should compare Elizabeth to enlightened monarchs like that of later Peter the Great of Russia and Frederick the Great of Prussia. Unlike them, Elizabeth did not see herself as a philosopher king or queen, introducing reforms for the people based on rational progress, although she viewed herself as married to the people. She did not build academies of science or reorganize law codes or trumpet Enlightenment ideals. Instead, she was what's called a pragmatist, someone who sought practical measures. But she did dare share with the Enlightenment rulers the use of image, performance, and reform in order to strengthen the state. She crafted herself as a queen of balance, neither too Catholic nor too Protestant, neither too cautious to Parliament nor completely absolute. If Peter the Great and Frederick the Great saw themselves as modernizers, well, Elizabeth saw herself as a stabilizer. Yet her stabilization allowed England to survive and eventually thrive. Now, to continue on to a newer segment that I have been using, or leaning on starting last episode, I wanted to look at a primary source or two and then focus on how to have a deeper, more nuanced understanding of a source by using an acronym called HIP, and I will use that here shortly. So as mentioned earlier, one of Elizabeth's famous pronouncements was her famous response to Parliament in 1566 when they pressed her on why she has not been married yet. And this is a short excerpt from what she said to Parliament. Was I not born in the realm? Were my parents born in any foreign country? Is not my kingdom here? Whom have I oppressed? Whom have I enriched in others' harm? What turmoil have I made in this commonwealth that I should be suspected to have no regard to the same? I will be tried by envy itself. I need not to use many words, for my deeds do try me. Again, this is her response to Parliament, a delegation of Parliament, about her marriage or lack thereof in 1566. Now, this is an excellent opportunity to take a short source like this, and I will put this in the show notes as well, in order to break it down and understand, I would say beyond the source, or kind of like peeling back layers of an onion or looking at different rings of a tree trunk. I love the concept of unraveling something like a ball of yarn, because you can take something that's seemingly so small and sort of broad and then peel back and find all these other connections that may go with it. And I want to do this with an acronym in AP history that we refer to as HIP, in order to break down a source into 4 separate categories, hence the acronym of the word. The first of those is something called historical context. This is kind of like focusing on what is happening in the year of 1566 or around that era that might have influenced this document or might be setting the stage for it. It's almost like the background of something. Like if we were to see a movie, the beginning of a movie, and it shows the skyline of a city and it says 1954 Montgomery, Alabama, right away, without seeing any characters or race or dialogue, we already have some context of the situation of this movie. We see 1954. We know that's like the onset of the civil rights movement in America. We see Montgomery, Alabama. We know that a very famous individual says no on that particular day and to get arrested. And then the response of a very famous pastor really spawns in the height, and I guess you'd say the momentum of the American civil rights movement. But think of historical situation sort of like that, and you can be as detailed or as sort of more broad as you want. The second part of HIP, called intended audience for the eye, this is who is the intended audience of the document you're looking at, who's meant to read it. And sometimes like this one, you're kind of lucky because it literally says the intended audience in the document or in the source line, which it says a response to Parliament. So we know now that's Parliament, but who else may be beyond just Parliament, or who within Parliament might she be really directing this at? The third of the acronym is the first P, the point of view part. And point of view is, well, who's the individual saying this, and how do they feel in terms of their leniency towards one way or another, and why do they feel that way? In this case, we have a sovereign queen of England, a queen that's ruling on her own, which again is transcendental in itself to see that it's not very likely to see it back then. And then the last P, which is the one that my students will use the most because it's more of determining the why, which is purpose. Why was this made? And this is where you can kind of get into more of that nuance. So let's break this down just to kind of help any student or teacher or someone interested in just kind of peeling back the layers of a document like this. So remember, I just read her response to Parliament in 1566. You can see that she mostly just asked a lot of rhetorical questions to them to defend more of a doubt in their mind, to apply like, why not me on that too, and then ending kind of with her deeds or her actions. So let's see if we can kind of break that down. In terms of historical context, we could partially be stated that this is brought up in 1566. Members of Parliament regularly petitioned Elizabeth to name a husband or an heir. Pressuring her was regarded as a threat to her authority and her realm stability. So she may have felt to be more inclined to be more direct about why she was not going to marry, because this was more than likely not the first time that she was petitioned by Parliament to explain herself on why she was or was not married. In this case, was not. As for intended audience, this was obviously Parliament, but also the wider political class and the nobility who might question her rule if she remained unmarried. Her most likely purpose was to assert that marriage is not an obligation imposed upon her, and to demand that her rule and records stand on their own merit. And lastly, and even though I inverted the P's, her point of view could be phrased as the sovereign queen of England, Elizabeth presented a defense of her autonomy and sovereignty as queen. This means her independent ability to rule, and emphasized that she rules by deeds or actions, not by social expectations. Now, additionally, a teacher or someone who is a history enthusiast could use this as another way to order or further analyze how Elizabeth frames gender and authority and legitimacy. Another powerful text to kind of go back on, that we won't do hip on, but you can if you would like, is her Tilbury speech in 1588, much later. She delivers this, as we said earlier, to her troops after the famous defeat of the Spanish Armada. But this is more of a full statement from that one, and I think it's a very powerful statement. Whether you're a woman or not, I think that a statement like this could give you goosebumps on how powerful this was if this was accurately quoted from her. She stated, in front of her men, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too, to lay down for my God and for my kingdom and my people, my honor and my blood. I myself will be your general." Again, this was a speech in front of her troops at Tilbury on August 9th, 1588. That's also a good setup for what we will see later on in terms of the divine right of kings. I plan on doing a whole episode on that and kind of showing some continuity from places like Asia, in which they had a concept called the mandate of heaven. So this is not the first time in history that religion has been used to legitimize a ruler in one way or another. Now, again, with students or others who might be interested in history, you can discuss how she juxtaposes physical weakness, in quotes, as a woman with spiritual and political strength, and how she invokes loyalty and sacrifice and divine sanction. Again, a very good setup for later. In one of our last sections tonight, I want to take more of a secondary, more modern look at Elizabeth I from a biographer kind of point of view here. So I was able to research and find a biographer from the year 2001. I was a junior in high school that year, another powerful year in American history. But there is a historian and professor of English language and literature at the University of Chicago named Janelle Mueller. I hope I'm pronouncing their name correctly. If not, then I apologize. This particular professor also had a specialization in English Renaissance and Reformation literature in its historical context, and she publishes exclusively on rulers and leaders like Elizabeth I. So I find her to be a very credible individual to comment on her. Now, this comes from a writing that she did entitled Virtue and Virtuality, Queen Elizabeth I and the Cult of the Body Politic from 2001. There's also licensed by the University of Chicago Press. And remember, this is an excerpt from that, not the whole thing, and it's also been a little bit condensed, just for clarity purposes, because I didn't want to take up too much more time from the episode tonight. So let's go ahead and see what Professor Mueller had said about Elizabeth. Elizabeth shows uncharacteristic anxiety about her feminine gender at intermittent points in her reign when courage is concerned. But for the most part, she represents herself as transcending the social and biological mandates associated with womanhood. She insists that, although being a woman by birth, she may exercise the prerogatives of the crown, without doubt, ambiguity, scruple, or question, that is, with the full authority of a sovereign of either sex. In her parliamentary speeches, she turns back suggestions of marriage by arguing that her gender is irrelevant to her capacity to rule and positing a benevolent, effective bond between herself and her subjects. In one speech, she declares, "Though I be a woman, yet I have yet I have as good a courage answerable to my own place as ever my father had." By these rhetorical strategies, Elizabeth negotiates her legitimacy as a queen in a male world. She claims divine sanction, regal office, and virtue to override gendered expectations, while sometimes acknowledging the tension involved. I will also include this source within the show notes. And if you're a teacher, this would be a great source to take. And then maybe if you didn't want to create them yourself, you can use AI like ChatGPT-5 in order to create you maybe 3 to 4 AP style multiple choice questions that could kind of test students' ability to answer and analyze a secondary source. So you're not like me and you're only using primary sources most of the time. Secondary sources is one of those things that I want to get better at utilizing within my class. I just don't find them to be as interesting in terms of using HIP with, but I understand in terms of certain points of view of the point of view or the intended audience, I find it to be more challenging and interesting at least whenever using that for primary sources, but you could use HIP for either one. Now, in terms of revisionist history, in terms of cultural perspectives as well, too. And again, you may not agree with these, and I may not agree with them either, but just to kind of look at some of the revisionist claims or theories about Elizabeth now in the year 2025. Some revisionists caution, like I said earlier, against this idea of the Golden Age mythology about Elizabeth. They argue that her reign was more precarious and more reliant on patronage and faction, and had serious social and economic problems such as poverty, inflation, and occasional religious suppression. Furthermore, the Puritan Choir thesis by John Neal claimed extreme Protestant members of the Parliament formed a group pushing Elizabeth further into reform. Later historians like Norman Jones and Christopher High challenged its influence and methodological soundness. So again, you even see other historians will kind of push back on revisionist historians about this too. So there is some opposition here. Therefore, it's up to you as the reader and someone who studies history and who's interested into it to determine how you want to view her role politically, especially amongst the continued conflict between Protestants and Catholics. Collinson in Elizabeth I and the Verdicts of History critiques the Whiggish narrative that sees Elizabeth as a proto-modern liberal monarch. He argues instead that we must understand her in her 16th century political, religious, and symbolic context, not through anachronistic lenses. That's an important part there too. I understand that argument, that sometimes we can easily place people in history in our modern era and try to look at them through lenses that way, instead of looking at the lenses from them back then and then the issues that were there politically, religious, and socially. That goes really well with things like Geosprite or Sprite or Pirates, in which some teachers use that to get students to look at the like political, intellectual, religious, artistic, technological, economic, or social effects or reasonings for certain things. Now, as usual, I want to end the night with 3 philosophical questions that you as the listener could take with you and have a discussion with somebody else or with your class if you're a teacher to kind of further push this discussion or maybe unravel even more that maybe we didn't think about before. My first of these three questions tonight is as follows. To what extent can a monarch's legitimacy rest on symbolic performance, such as language, ceremony, and image, rather than on legal or coercive power? Did Elizabeth succeed by being a queen you feel loyal to, rather than simply one you must obey as an absolutist? My second overall question, is it more stable for a ruler to aim for moderation and compromise, as Elizabeth often did, or to define a bold, ambiguous direction, even at a risk of polarization? Which approach best serves long-term political stability, especially the terms long-term? Again, I messed up that question there, but I'll have those in the show notes at the bottom. Later enlightened monarchs claimed to rule for the people, in quotes, promoting reforms and rational government and progress. But my last question here, was there something in Elizabeth I's reign that foreshadowed this ideal? Or was she fundamentally a pragmatist who wielded power through negotiation, symbolism, and selective reform? As usual, I appreciate all of you listeners for joining me for this episode. I was able to keep it underneath the 30 minutes, which is good for any of you that might be driving to work or exercising or just wanting to listen to some history. I plan on doing my next episode either about James I or about the English Civil War. I'll probably do James I there. And then next week, as I wanted to remind people, I will be interviewing JD from History Underground from YouTube and other social media outlets. That's going to be a great interview, and I've looked up to him a lot as a history enthusiast and a historian the last 2 years and followed his channel. I also have a podcast discussion philosophically about why should we wrestle or study history, which should be recorded on the 11th or the 12th. With Mike and Bob from X's and Joe's podcast. Both of them are excellent history enthusiasts and have really strong backgrounds. And that's kind of my plan going forward. I'll also pepper in plenty of episodes of me doing some content, but I also want to keep doing the interviews and discussions with other people along the way. So as always, continue to keep questioning the past in order to understand the present and be contagious.